Will harvesting big data reap the big economic benefits it touts, and in so doing help the global economy recover faster? That's one of the main subjects in this year's Global Information Technology Report, which also compares the ability of countries to spread information and communication technologies. Here to tell us more is Bruno Lanvin, Executive Director of INSEAD's European Competitiveness Initiative, and Bernat Bilbao, Senior Economist of Global Competitiveness and Benchmarking Network at the World Economic Forum. Bruno, let's start with you. What were the main findings in this year's report?
Well, there's stability at the top. The top 5 are the same as the ones we had last year. Scandinavian countries being 3 out of the top 5, plus the Netherlands. Between 5 and 10, we see large countries coming up, like the UK and the US, who remain stable in that group as well. We see also some significant changes among large emerging countries, many of them for lower rankings, which leads us to consider obstacles by which large emerging countries are hitting what we called last year a glass wall, by which they are not receiving all the benefits from the changes made in ICT, and discovering that there are other obstacles to receiving those benefits, especially in the area of talents and skills. We also see that the digital divide is not homogeneous, and that it has different shapes in all regions. We have a divide in Europe between Northern Europe and Southern and Eastern Europe. We have a divide in the Middle East between the GCC countries on one hand and Northern African countries, and we have other divides in other parts of the world. A major finding we see also coming out from the report this year is that indeed policies matter. And policies have to do not just with ICT-specific measures, but also with the environment, business climate, ability to bring foreign investment, attract talent. All that is becoming very clear again from the rankings of this year's report.
Bernat, which countries were the top performers in this year's Network Readiness Index?
Well, this year, as in the previous years, we have the Nordic economies together with the Asian tigers at the top of our ranking. In addition to that, we also had some large Western economies such as the US and the United Kingdom also in the top 10.
What were the major changes with the previous index?
In general, what we see is, relatively stable results throughout the index. However, we also see a few countries that have actually moved up in the rankings, especially Asian countries. We see countries like Indonesia, Philippines going up. And at the same time, we also see a few countries that have been lagging behind, especially large emerging economies and notably some of the BRICS economies. This is due to the fact that not so much that they are not doing or taking the right steps to leverage their ICT systems, but mainly because there are other countries that are going faster than them, and therefore they are moving ahead of them in the rankings.
Bruno, what are the key lessons for countries looking to improve their information and communications capabilities from this year's Best in Class?
One of the main lessons is that these things don't happen overnight. Much has been said recently about the ability of smaller economies to be more agile, to mobilize their resources, to change their policies. On the other hand, we see that being small is not the only advantage that you can generate. We're very encouraged, for instance, by the improvements of large countries like Indonesia, gaining 12 ranks in this year's ranking. We also see that there are regional dynamics at play by which countries can draw lessons from the experience of their neighbors. And it's sometimes much easier to infer lessons from your neighbors with similar economic, social, cultural environments than from other parts of the world.
Bernat, how is the index compiled? What does it measure?
We gather information for 54 indicators, and that we aggregate them together around 10 pillars that we believe that are underlying, the digital potential of the countries, and also how well they are embedded into the innovation ecosystem. In addition, what we have with this index is the impacts in terms of economic and social returns that are coming up or coming out of leveraging ICT. The measure actually assesses the capacity of different economies to develop and deploy ICT and benefit from it. This is really what the index is trying to assess.
Bruno, were there any results that you found surprising?
Mauritius, which is at the top of African countries, is again making significant progress. So it tells us that somehow, in spite of the resistance to reduce the digital divide, even countries which are in the more remote areas of development, typically sub-Saharan Africa, but other parts of the world as well, show the way by being inventive, by being innovative, and by gearing their ICT investment to higher levels of competitiveness, growth, and job creation.
Banat, this year's report looks at the peril and the promise of big data. But what needs to be done by governments and businesses to make sure that big data is not just the next passing fad?
First of all, we have to recognize that big data is here. We know that the amount of information, structure and unstructured, that is available has increased immensely in the last years. What it is important is that organizations, both public and private, can actually obtain value out of this big data. For that, these organizations will have to identify what type of data they want to focus on and analyze, develop the right set of analytics that can actually make sense of this big data, but also, more importantly, to create the right set of organizational structures and develop the necessary skills that can actually make sense of this big data.
What are the differences in networked readiness between the developed and developing world? And is this digital divide getting worse, getting better?
Well, what we see is that the digital divide, at least what we see is that there is not a real bridging on this digital divide. It's not that it's getting better or worse, but we see that there is no real improvement, especially in terms of the impacts. That is what has led us to coin this term of the new digital divide, that is not related so much about ICT infrastructure, but much more about the actual impacts that different organizations can obtain from this ICT infrastructure.
Bruno, what is your outlook for technological development in the coming years?
The theme of the report this year was big data, because clearly we felt that this was a theme that was going to change the landscape. And the analysis carried out in the report of this year, including the chapters provided by various partners, private and public, show that this indeed is going to change the landscape. On top of that, the extent to which broadband will start reaching various parts of the world will be important. We see in the reasons why the digital divide remains between some countries which are less advanced and the more advanced countries is precisely because of the lack of speed or pace in the development of basic infrastructure. Broadband can address that. So we have an infrastructure dimension, typically broadband. We have a content dimension. Big data is an example of that. We will have also more and more a policy dimension, where issues like data privacy, like internet governance will also come into play, will be discussed actively in the coming months, and will determine to a large extent how the world as a whole will be able to take advantage of the IT revolution and on the globalization of the internet.
Bruno and Banat, thank you both for talking to INSEAD Knowledge today.
Thank you.